The doors of the examination chamber hissed open with the polite indignation of a spaceship that thought itself more important than anyone in it. I stepped inside, boots clanging on the metallic floor in a rhythm that seemed vaguely militaristic but entirely inadequate given the situation. Across the room, standing perfectly still as if she had just emerged from a dream and found herself in a science lab by accident, was her. The alien woman, though only partly alien in appearance, had a presence that could disarm a battalion. Her body was human-like in every ordinary way, a slender frame, delicate fingers, the kind of face that could make a poet forget his verses. But there was a twist, a single detail that made every automatic assumption I had about humans, biology, and professionalism evaporate. Her ears, long, graceful, curving upward like the sails of some elegant interstellar yacht, they caught the laboratory lights and flickered reflections across the walls as if they had their own little gravitational field of attention. I could already feel my notes trembling in my hands, although technically my hands were shaking because I had poured coffee into the wrong console and the machine had beeped at me in what I assumed was judgment. She looked at me, of course. That was the first mistake, letting her look at me. Not because of the human-animal instinct to survive when confronted by a predator, but because she knew. Her gaze was amused, intelligent, and mildly conspiratorial, the kind of look that suggested she understood exactly how ridiculous my military uniform looked, how painfully aware I was of my own nervousness, and how desperately I wanted to make some credible scientific first impression. I tried to clear my throat and sound important. "Good morning, Subject 42, I said, forcing the words out with the kind of authority reserved for men who had never actually met the subject they were addressing. She tilted her head slightly, ears pivoting like finely tuned satellite dishes, and I swore I caught a hint of laughter in her eyes. 42? She asked, voice smooth and melodic, the kind of voice that made breathing a negotiation. I thought you humans liked names. Her words were a gentle jab, and I stumbled over my clipboard, which made a sound suspiciously like a sneeze but technically wasn't. I cursed silently, as if the universe hadn't already noticed my humiliation. I approached her with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb while simultaneously trying to juggle 3 experimental tools and the last shred of dignity I possessed. She didn't move, she only regarded me, watching the futile choreography of my preparations as if she were a teacher grading a very bad class. "All right," I said, trying to sound calm, "let's begin the examination." I reached for the scanner and it beeped at me, complaining about coffee stains, and suddenly I wasn't a soldier or a researcher. I was a mess of human ineptitude under alien scrutiny. She laughed then, a soft, clear sound that made the sterile walls feel like they belonged to a theater instead of a laboratory. I frowned. Laughter in the lab is not protocol, I reminded myself, but her ears twitched again, and the whole idea of protocol melted into dust. The examination began, slowly, meticulously, because someone, by which I mean me, was determined not to appear incompetent while simultaneously failing spectacularly. I started with the basics. Bone structure, muscle tone, reflexes. Every time I adjusted a scanner, she made a subtle movement, tilting her head, stretching her fingers, arching her back in a way that turned the scientific observation into a very dangerous kind of distraction. I attempted a measurement of her arm span, and in a move that I can only describe as profoundly human, she caught my wrist before I could fumble the tape. "You're trying too hard," she said, and I nearly tripped over a hovering drone carrying my notes. That drone beeped at me as if it were mildly insulted by my incompetence. I glared at it. It beeped again. Alien machines have no sense of humor, I realized. As I continued, I found myself noticing details I wasn't supposed to notice. Her skin had a faint luminescence, like the shimmer of starlight trapped underwater. Her ears flickered with expression, communicating subtle nuances that no translator could capture, and her eyes, bright, sharp, and impossibly understanding, followed every move I made with what could only be described as theatrical patience. I caught myself smiling at her small quirks, which is how I realized that science had officially lost control. I tried to catalog the structure of her musculature, the way her bones shifted under the surface, and the hum of her heartbeat, but each time I took a measurement, she moved in a way that made me question whether she was cooperating or performing an elaborate joke on my species. At one point, I attempted to calibrate the holographic scanner for a detailed internal mapping. I misread the interface and ended up projecting a three-dimensional skeleton of what looked like a dancing platypus over her chest. She arched an eyebrow and let out a giggle that sounded like music in zero gravity. I cursed softly, muttering something about human error and alien patience, but she only smiled, clearly entertained. Her ears twitched in rhythm with my embarrassment, and I realized that perhaps interspecies humor was more dangerous than interstellar warfare. She leaned forward, placing her hand lightly on my scanner console, and in a moment of cosmic irony, I dropped my pen. It bounced off the floor, off the console, and onto her foot, and she didn't flinch. She only looked down at it with a bemused expression as if to say, "Really? That's the best you can do?" Hours passed, or minutes, or perhaps days. The lab's artificial lighting made time a vague suggestion rather than a fact. I tried to continue my work with the detached professionalism that my orders demanded, but every time I focused on a measurement, she added a subtle movement or a teasing expression that reminded me, painfully and delightfully, that science could not capture this. And yet, despite the growing chaos of spilled notes, malfunctioning equipment, and my own self-consciousness, there was an undeniable rhythm to our interaction. Curiosity met amusement, observation met subtle play, and slowly the laboratory transformed from a sterile, controlled environment into something that felt alive, as if her presence alone could bend metal, light, and human discipline alike. By the end of the first day, I sat back in my chair, exhausted, my notes a messy tangle of numbers, sketches, and muttered exclamations. She stood across the room, arms folded, ears flicking lazily, eyes glimmering with what could only be amusement. I realized then that the line between researcher and participant had not just blurred, it had evaporated entirely. Humor, fascination, and an unexpected warmth had crept into the sterile protocols of military science, and I knew with an uncomfortable clarity that my mind was no longer fully my own. She was not just an alien subject. She was something far more complicated, far more compelling, and I, despite every instinct for discipline, reason, and order, was hopelessly captivated. And somewhere between a misplaced holographic skeleton, a bouncing pen, and ears that flickered like starlight, I understood that studying her anatomy was no longer a question of science. It was a question of survival for my focus, my professionalism, and perhaps my sanity. The scanner buzzed again, a tiny digital sigh that somehow sounded like it was judging me personally, and I could feel my hands trembling as if they had formed their own nervousness committee. She was across the room, leaning casually against a console, ears flicking like twin antennas that were picking up frequencies I couldn't hear but could somehow feel in my chest. I had decided today would be different. Today I would be professional. Today I would measure, map, and document her anatomy with clinical precision. And yet, the moment I opened my notebook, her gaze caught mine and I froze, pen hovering like a hesitant alien moth. She tilted her head, eyes sparkling with that unsettling combination of curiosity and amusement, and I realized that even my best attempts at focus were doomed. My notebook, filled with perfectly ordered charts and columns, suddenly seemed irrelevant in the face of her calm, unassuming dominance over the room, her subtle movements, the tiny curl of a finger that made me want to note more than just bone density. I attempted to start with something simple, a routine check of the forearm, but she moved just enough to disrupt my measurements. "Precision is boring," she said lightly, and I blinked, unsure if she had spoken English or if my translator had glitched. I frowned at the scanner, which beeped as if in solidarity with her, and muttered, "This is scientific work. Humor is not protocol." She tilted her head again, ears twitching, and gave a small, musical laugh that sounded like a bell tangled in wind. I nearly dropped the scanner. It beeped indignantly. She caught my hand with a gentle touch and let it linger just enough to distract me further. I was supposed to observe her physiology, not feel the pull of curiosity I hadn't signed up for, but every subtle movement, every glimmer of intelligence in her eyes, made my mind unspool in ways my training had not prepared me for. As I recalibrated, trying to focus on the skeletal structure, I discovered something entirely unexpected. Her muscles seemed to shift fluidly beneath the skin, not the stiff, mechanical way human muscles did under strain, but like water caught in slow motion, reshaping subtly with every gesture. I adjusted the holographic scanner, projecting a transparent overlay of her anatomy, only to realize that I had accidentally set it to artistic interpretation mode, and a three-dimensional projection of what looked suspiciously like a ballerina performing zero-gravity pirouettes floated above her. She raised an eyebrow, ears twitching in amusement, and said, "You think humans are subtle?" I coughed, nearly hitting the console, and made a mental note to double-check the interface instructions again. The room seemed to vibrate with her quiet amusement, and I realized I was grinning like a fool in a laboratory where smiles were supposed to be irrelevant. I moved on to reflex tests, trying to maintain some semblance of control, but she anticipated every action with a subtle twitch of her hand, a flick of her ears, a barely perceptible shift in her stance. Every time I jotted notes, she leaned forward, sometimes close enough that I could feel a faint pulse of warmth through the scanner. "You're too tense," she said, voice like wind chimes in slow motion, and I couldn't help but murmur, "I am not tense. I am methodical." She laughed, a soft, tinkling sound that made the metallic floor feel warmer, and I realized that my own definition of professionalism was crumbling, melting into fascination and an uncomfortable, thrilling sense of inadequacy. The day passed in small, chaotic bursts. I attempted to measure limb flexibility, and she mimicked my movements with subtle exaggeration, making me trip over a stray drone that hovered too close. The drone beeped in sympathy or maybe in judgment, I wasn't sure. At one point, I tried to map the resonance of her heartbeat using a pulse scanner, only for it to produce a waveform that looked more like abstract music than physiology. She leaned close, ears brushing against the scanner, and whispered, "Are your measurements always this creative?" I cursed silently, realizing she found my clumsiness as entertaining as I found her impossible elegance distracting. Every small slip became a shared joke, a rhythm of humor that interwove with the careful science I was supposed to be conducting. I started noticing things I wasn't supposed to. The slight curvature of her spine when she stretched, the subtle ripple under her skin when she shifted her weight, the way her fingers traced the air as though conducting music no one else could hear. I tried to document, to categorize, to remain scientific, but the lines between observation and admiration blurred. I found myself laughing at my own mistakes, at the absurdity of trying to catalog the impossible, and she laughed with me, not at me, though the teasing in her tone was undeniable. Each flick of her ears, each playful tilt of her head, became a signal I learned to interpret almost instinctively. I began to anticipate her movements, noting not just the structure of her body but the personality that inhabited it, the intelligence that flowed through every subtle gesture. During a particularly delicate test of hand dexterity, I accidentally activated a module that projected holographic butterflies into the lab. They flitted between us, reflecting colored light across her skin, and I swore the moment would be ruined. She extended a hand, catching one as it hovered near her palm, and smiled. "Do humans always fight with their own machines?" she asked, and I nearly laughed out loud, realizing that she considered my technical errors part of the entertainment. I tried to regain focus, but the butterflies, the laughter, the shifting lights, and her impossibly patient amusement had transformed the laboratory into a theater, a stage for chaos disguised as research. My notes had become incomprehensible, a mixture of charts, sketches, and fragments of conversation, yet somehow it felt like progress, an entirely different kind of progress that science manuals never mentioned. By the end of the session, I had discovered far more about her than I had any right to in a strictly scientific sense. Her physiology was extraordinary, her reflexes near perfect, her movements a symphony of fluidity and precision. But beyond the anatomy, I had learned the subtleties of her humor, the intelligence behind her teasing, the way her ears twitched in rhythm with thoughts unspoken. I realized that my own fascination was no longer purely professional. I laughed at a minor mishap, and she mirrored it, ears flicking in amusement, eyes glinting with shared understanding. Science, I realized, had nothing on the connection forming across that lab, a connection built on curiosity, humor, and the thrill of exploring a being so alien yet so startlingly familiar. As the lights dimmed and the lab prepared for night cycle, I sat amidst scattered notes, misaligned scanners, and a floating projection of what may or may not have been a dancing skeleton. She watched me quietly, ears brushing gently against the console, and I realized with an uneasy and delightful certainty that nothing about this examination was ordinary. She was not just a subject, not just an experiment. She was a force that challenged the definitions of science, humor, and fascination, all at once, and I, despite every protocol drilled into me, was thoroughly, irreparably captivated. The lab was quiet, at least in the sense that the usual hum of machinery had quieted to a low murmur, though my mind was anything but silent. The alien woman stood at the far end, ears angled like delicate sails catching an invisible wind, and I realized with a combination of dread and excitement that today would be different. Not because I had suddenly regained my professional composure, heaven forbid, but because I had begun to understand her in ways that were neither scientific nor fully rational. Each session over the past days had peeled back layers, and now I knew the danger was no longer merely that of losing focus. The danger was falling, wholly and irreversibly, into the gravity of fascination she wielded effortlessly. I approached the central console, attempting to calibrate the holographic mapping device, and immediately misfired a pulse that sent a projection of her skeletal system spinning like a miniature galaxy in midair. She chuckled, the sound fluid and melodic, and I muttered, "I swear I'm usually more competent than this," to which she leaned forward, tapping her finger against the floating bones with the faintest tilt of her head. "Competence is relative," she said, ears flicking in perfect timing, especially across species. I paused, realizing she had just delivered an interstellar joke, and I laughed despite myself, the sound echoing in the sterile chamber, mingling with the soft hum of the hovering drones. I began the final series of tests, ostensibly to record structural and physiological data, but my hands moved with a newfound ease. Not because I had mastered the alien anatomy, far from it, but because I had learned to let go of my rigid definitions of order, to find rhythm in chaos, to accept that sometimes the subject of a study refused to be contained by charts and numbers. She watched with amusement, occasionally shifting position, ears curling slightly forward, eyes sharp and bright with playful curiosity. In one instance, I reached for the pulse sensor only to have her hand brush mine, deliberately, just enough to make the reading spike in nonsensical patterns. "The instruments don't lie," I said, exasperated. "Yet they do," she replied lightly, as if the universe itself had conspired to produce her, a being who could turn physics and protocol into improvisational comedy. We moved on to more complex examinations, testing balance, neural response, and joint articulation. I found myself narrating the process aloud, half to maintain professionalism and half to cope with the absurdity of my own fascination. "So, the long ears," I said, holding one gently as a makeshift lever, "function as a secondary sensory input, correct?" She flexed them experimentally, flicking them back and forth like twin radar dishes. "Sometimes," she said, eyes gleaming, "sometimes they simply enjoy the attention." I laughed, realizing that she was teaching me not only about alien anatomy but also about the subtle, human-like humor of her species. By the time we reached the reflex tests, I had stopped worrying about accuracy. I let the instruments run themselves, allowing my observations to be guided by instinct and curiosity. She reacted not with irritation but with encouragement, ears twitching in a rhythm that somehow felt like applause. Midway through a particularly intricate test of tactile response, I caught myself staring, not at a measurement, not at a diagram, but at her. At the way her fingers moved, precise yet elegant, the way her head tilted in thought, the way her eyes tracked mine with that impossible combination of intelligence and amusement. And suddenly, I understood. I had ceased merely examining her. I had begun participating in a dialogue, a slow and intricate dance between species, a conversation that transcended language and scanners and military orders. She reached forward and tapped a console, projecting a holographic map of the station's gravity vectors, and whispered almost conspiratorially, "Do you always follow instructions, or are you finally learning to improvise?" I smirked, realizing that my own training had been supplanted by something far more valuable: adaptability, patience, and a willingness to embrace wonder. By the afternoon cycle, we had created an accidental symphony of misaligned instruments, floating holograms, and amused drones. I made a deliberate misstep to knock a small scanner off the table, and she caught it effortlessly, smiling, ears angled in that subtle arch that always seemed to mock yet charm me simultaneously. "You've changed," she said, voice calm, warm. I froze, uncertain whether she meant my methods, my fascination, or something deeper. "I've learned," I replied honestly, that science is not just about control. It's about observation, connection, and occasionally humility. She tilted her head, letting a soft, musical laugh escape. Good, humility suits humans rarely, but it suits you. We moved on to the final mapping exercise, this time with her fully cooperating, offering gestures and subtle movements designed to help the data collection. I realized then that she was teaching me more than anatomy. She was showing me patience, intelligence, and the profound complexity of connection. Each subtle twitch of her ears, each playful expression, each moment of shared laughter had dismantled my rigid understanding of what it meant to observe, to measure, to exist in the company of another sentient being. And when the session concluded and the last hologram faded into the dimmed laboratory lighting, I realized that the soldier who had entered the room days ago, nervous, disciplined, and entirely focused on protocol, was gone. In his place stood someone changed, reshaped by curiosity, humor, and the slow gravity of fascination. She watched me, arms folded, ears quivering ever so slightly, eyes gleaming. "You understand now," she said softly, almost conspiratorially. I nodded, a small, genuine smile crossing my face. "I understand that some things cannot be contained in a chart. That some lessons are learned only in presence, in interaction, in connection." She moved closer, fingers brushing mine lightly in farewell, and I felt the culmination of every misstep, every laugh, every chaotic moment settle like a quiet tide across my consciousness. Humor, science, fascination, they had merged into understanding, and it was more complete than I had imagined possible. As I left the lab that evening, the station quiet except for the soft hum of the life support systems,